All right, so let's go right in. Let's kick right in. You know the name of the piece. You know a little bit about my background, some of you? I mean, it'll come through in the piece, so I need not say more. But anyway, I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at this very moment. The piece has an epigraph, which I will read just because it's brief and because I refer back to it in the course of the piece itself. It comes from William James, American psychologist, philosopher. This is something James wrote all the way back in 1876, which for James was quite early. He was a young guy and figured out, like a lot of us, what he wanted to do when he grew up. James wrote, "Philosophic study means the habit of always seeking an alternative, of not taking the usual for granted, of making conventionalities fluid again. Coming to terms. The great part of what happens to us in life is never articulated to anyone. That is not usually because experience is painful, shameful, or difficult to describe. It is simply because we do a lot more living than speaking. Obvious enough. But those of us who live in the world of talk, and often enough for the world of talk, may be especially likely to forget how small that realm is. Silence, in the sense of experience never discussed, is the rule. Talk is the exception. Those of us who work in the more particular area of talk about horrific experiences often become especially interested in what is and is not said, can and cannot be retold. I speak as someone who has spent most of the past 40 years interviewing Holocaust survivors. In contrast with most testimony projects, almost always based on single interviews, I've pursued multiple interviews with the same survivors over months, years, with a few people even decades. One of the advantages of sustained conversation is that it facilitates differentiating what may be conflated in more limited encounters. Indeed, oral history in general may serve us in the same way that James hoped for philosophy, to work against taking the usual for granted, to help make conventionalities fluid again. Challenging, or at least complicating, the usual, as entrenched in power, habit, or both, has always been a large part of what we do. This short piece aims toward a more differentiated and complicating analysis of silence in survivors' accounts. Specifically, to distinguish between what I call the unsaid, the incommunicable, the unbearable, and the irretrievable. Whatever the utility of these categories, and there are undoubtedly more, these are not mutually exclusive, my goal is to enhance our appreciation of the range and complexity of survivors' silences. Although it is most often invoked in connection with silence, psychic trauma does not play a central role in my analysis. I believe discourse about trauma is quintessentially one of those conventionalities that could usefully be made more fluid. The unsaid. The unsaid is by far the largest category of silences. It encompasses the great range of things that survivors could theoretically talk about in an interview, but choose not to. Choose is the key word. In general, we underestimate the extent to which survivors are deliberate and strategic about how and what they recount. The idea that indelible memories almost literally dictate a particular account is mythological. Interviews with Holocaust survivors involve the same contingencies that always impact what is and isn't relayed in interviews. Questions asked and not asked, chemistry between participants, format of the recording, i.e. audio or video, a range of reasons participants protect themselves or others, what best fits the evolving trajectory of an interview or interview series, which is its own context, and everything else that motivates reticence or revelation. The very fact of inviting someone to speak as a survivor inevitably foregrounds the Holocaust as cause, and the rest that one has to retell as some version of effect. And over the course of sustained conversation, what survivors initially attribute to the Holocaust often turns out, according to their own retelling, to have other life historical roots, many having nothing to do with the genocide. Typically, how survivors explain their lives thus changes over the course of multiple interviews and in ways impossible to foresee in a first meeting. Survivors' perceptions of their listeners' knowledge, attentiveness, and emotional capacities also play a particularly important role in how they craft their accounts. Abe Pasternak, a survivor whom I've known since the 1970s, discussed the evolving centrality of one story he tells after discovering it was an account his listeners could, quote, relate to. The story turns on Abe's guilt over feeling he had abandoned his, quote, kid brother when they arrived at Auschwitz, and Abe reflected about listener response. They can't understand, they can't relate to the terror, the smell, the chaos, the dead bodies all around. How can they relate to that? But this, their guilt story, this they can relate to. Yeah, I noticed that. This they related to. Indeed, the relating accelerated. Abe's story was eventually featured in a video loop that plays continuously in a local Holocaust Memorial Center. And Abe described the consequences. People react. They do, yeah. People come up and they say, this is the man with the kid brother. They know me that way. People, strange people, when they saw me, they say, this is the man with the kid brother. And they seem to be insisting that I should repeat that story. So apparently, I don't know, it makes quite an impression. Abe is not shy, but making this much of an impression was too much. Today, he mostly avoids retelling the story about his brother, in part, he says, because of his discomfort with others' reactions. The wider point is that knowing the ways an account changes over time and across circumstances, and hearing survivors' reflections about the choices behind those changes is always deeply informing. In this case, listener response both encouraged Abe's retelling a particular story and, in the end, encouraged his avoiding it. Sometimes, the story behind the story concerns the immediate circumstance of an account's construction. Leon, also a survivor I've known for many years, retold the same story in each of our first 3 interviews in 1979, the only episode that he repeated in this way. Struck by the repetition, I wondered if there was more to be understood about the story's significance. The episode concerned the shooting of Paul Lieberman, a well-liked prisoner who had been favored even by the guards. When I asked Leon about his returns to the memory, he was glad to elucidate. He said, you posed the question. I owe you an explanation. There are a few elements you couldn't have known. The key such element was that Lieberman's execution signified that no one would survive, an implication nowhere apparent in Leon's earlier retelling. He explained, this was the moment of truth. Lieberman was a favorite, even to them, to the Germans. He was a favorite. And all of a sudden we see no one's life is worth a damn. They would kill you with as much thought as it takes to step on a cockroach. And so our pipe dream of surviving was shattered right there. It was suddenly and dramatically shattered, together with Lieberman's skull. Caught up in the memory and the doom it recalled, with his execution, the whole thing came to a standstill. Leon remembered the only reality left over here is death. Leon was drawn to say more. In direct response to my half-question, so this story, Leon insisted about all his Holocaust retelling. It is not a story. It has to be made a story in order to convey it, and with all the frustration that implies. Because at best you compromise. You compromise. I will retell to Leon's striking formulation. Here I emphasize the immediate impacts of the intent and accident in these interview exchanges. Had Leon and I not met multiple times, the Lieberman story obviously would not have been repeated. And I would almost certainly not have asked more about it. Without the kind of collaboration that he and I developed over the course of these meetings, unlikely that he would have explained it as he did. If I had not phrased my question, so this story, I could easily have said this episode or this memory. It is a virtual certainty that Leon would not have made his general comment about stories as compromises. A comment which, I will say, made an enormous difference over the next 30 years in my understanding of survivors, which, as you hear, evolved almost accidentally. I introduced the word story that directly prompted his assertion. Finally, by definition, any compromise can change, as the Lieberman story clearly did change, as Leon and I discussed it. Co-construction, a term so often used to describe the review process, is another conventionality that subsumes a great many different things, perhaps too many. And so the utility of more detailed analyses of interview transactions that determine what is and is not said. Listeners include not only those immediately present, interviewers, other interlocutors, but also whatever general expectations of survivors and historical knowledge of the Holocaust survivors perceive as being out there. Another fruit of multiple interviews is survivors talk more and more about those factors. For example, Leon described the role of conventional Holocaust imagery, in which there was simply no representation of the kind of slave labor camp where he had endured 2 years of the war and where Lieberman was killed. As a result, his experience in that camp became what he called a, quote, private nightmare. Said, some things people know about or think they know about. There are the same scenes in every movie, and they're more or less in the public domain. The liquidation of a ghetto, a shooting, the arrival at Auschwitz, or Arbor on Friday. There are also private nightmares, which require a completely different scenario. Some individual horror stories, it becomes almost... I remember reading somewhere about somebody having a nightmare, and he feels like screaming, and no words come out. You know, this horrible feeling, if only I could scream, and call for help, I'd be all right. And no words come out. And somehow you feel the same way. The muted scream is iconic of dramatic silencing. Here, however, Leon's private nightmares reflect less the terror he knows than the history we do not, or probably most accurately. They reflect both. Survivors describe having to contend that the Holocaust is represented in the public domain constantly. Memoirist Ruth Kluwer warns her readers that to usefully engage her own account, you will have to, quote, rearrange your inner museum of the Holocaust. For decades, those who survived the destruction as children in hiding rarely spoke publicly, as you all know, because the hidden child experience was simply outside popular Holocaust representation, anything notwithstanding. Many survivors choose not to speak about unexpectedly positive, even euphoric experiences during the destruction because they know that such episodes do not fit the Holocaust as generally imagined. And still others leave out moments of agency, even heroism, for fear that such accounts would impugn those incapable of such initiative. Meanwhile, because they also know we look for survivor heroes, they fear such accounts would end up obscuring the extent to which luck was always at the fore. What has become the conventional mode of gathering survivors' accounts? A few hours in front of the video camera both selects in and selects out, as does every way of engaging survivors. For some survivors, the very formality and specialness of the testimonial occasion is assuring. 2 focused hours for the sake of posterity, and they can, at least publicly, let it be. For others, the same formality provokes frustration. And so Agi Rubin, responding to what she called a form, quote, in one of the large video testimony projects, responded with a form of her own. She provided what she called, quote, the usual spiel, the default version of her experience that she'd honed in numerous public talks, testimonies, schools, and so on. Stacy Zinverki has discussed the differences between what some survivors retell in public settings and what they say and what they may confide within personal friendship. Historian Ken Walser has provided another example of the impact of format. A survivor who refused a direct interview, but who initiated a series of emails, of which there are now scores, in which he retold Holocaust memories in limited, controllable bits. This survivor, in effect, created his own format for retelling and for not retelling. Many survivors carry memories that are never articulated simply because they are discrete fragments without apparent significance. Authors also describe how sharing immediately relevant historical information in an interview provoked otherwise unspoken memories because they now had context. Beyond whatever account the survivor has learned, generally works like Agi's usual spiel. What survivors say and what they do not is thus rarely predictable. Often, it has as much to do with the accident of meeting certain others as with the accident of being a certain self. No less for Holocaust survivors than for the rest of us. The incommunicable. By the incommunicable, I mean phenomena that survivors realize are inherently difficult to convey. Most obviously sensory memories, such as smells or tastes, and psychological states for which listeners rarely have analogy. We've heard Abe's list of what listeners are unlikely to relate to. The terror, the smell, the chaos, the dead bodies all around. Smell plays a particularly central role in survivors' memories. The stench of unwashed bodies, burning flesh, rot, decay. Olfactory memories are literally part of the broader atmosphere of the destruction, the horrific totality, which is my focus in this section. Here again, it is important to emphasize that survivors may judge certain experiences to be incommunicable, not because they are emotionally overwhelming, although they may be, but simply because they are so alien. Agi once reflected, it's like a child watching the horror movies, just simply, there it is. This is the same thing. Retelling the events of the horror movie is very challenging, especially for kids. But Agi was also keenly aware that we rely in so-called normal life, as some survivors put it, on a presumed difference between horror movies and reality. Echoing many other survivors, Agi continued, even to us, our mind couldn't grasp it. So how could I make you understand something my own mind doesn't grasp? I have sometimes explored the ways we try to grasp it by asking my students midway through a semester to describe what they see when they imagine themselves in a camp. They've read and heard accounts that refer to mountains of dead bodies. It's the corpses lying around like garbage in this cave. Nevertheless, when my students imagine being in a death camp, the visions they share are almost always devoid of dead people. Any simple invocation of psychological distancing as a way to explain this phenomenon does not engage the more fundamental challenge of imagining a world in which the distinction between actuality and worst possible fantasy, in which that distinction has been obliterated. The gaining a perspective on experience, having enough distance to stand back and respond, emotionally and otherwise, depends on that distinction. Rather than fleeing emotional response, I believe my students are attempting to preserve it. Survivors emphasize a related challenge. Primo Levi insisted that the hardest thing to convey was not specific horrors, but the all-pervasive, quote, lack of events. Because memory works in precisely the opposite way. The single, clamorous, terrifying episodes, and conversely, the happy moments prevail and invade the canvas. Whereas as one lives them, they are part of a totally disintegrated reality. Over the course of our interviews, Leon returned several times to the same difference between retelling single episodes, however horrific, and conveying a sense of the encompassing totality. A painting, he said, was, quote, either representative or abstract, but here, in effect, you try to do both. The destruction had to be retold in, quote, human terms and through the, quote, experiences of individuals, but none of that encompassed what Leon called the surrealistic landscape, pure landscape of death he remembered. And that landscape, both encompassing and unbounded, was the essential thing. Canvases, landscapes, paintings. These metaphors from visual media hint at the not-story that Leon's main stories point towards, but do not themselves convey. Literary scholar Sidra Ezrahi notes that, quote, the visual arts appear to be more amenable than the literary medium to representing mass atrocity, largely because, quote, literature, like music, has a sequence, not a simultaneity of events. In their efforts to retell, survivors work hard to emphasize simultaneity rather than unfolding, often by repeating the conjunction and. Immersion rather than perspective, lack of events as the rule, and episodes with duration, e.g. stories, as the exception. In effect, survivors struggle to convey a world in which nothing, meaning no one thing, happens, and everything happens at the same time. Likewise, as Levy suggested, they retell in bits what they remember as, quote, totally disintegrated wholes. That is why I have argued that the concept of integrating narratives in such contexts is chimeric. Leon's notion of stories standing for not stories, painfully known as compromises, and in essential respects misrepresentations, takes us further. The unbearable. Invoking the unbearable is the way survivors' silences is most often interpreted. Survivors' fear of experiencing or re-experiencing agonies that are psychologically overwhelming. In contrast to silence associated with what is least communicable, I've emphasized the alien and surreal totality. The silence associated with the unbearable reflects anguish that is immediate and visceral. Lydia literally lost her voice during the war after seeing a group of murdered children, all in pools of blood, she recalls. In the Love Ghetto, she was herself a child at the time. Like other survivors, she contends with the possibility of being muted again. Aki notes that, quote, you don't want to get into it to a deepness that you feel you can't get out. And she's generally capable of avoiding, but active monitoring how and what she retells, falling into that deepness. Leon similarly describes the limits he observes, even with the most responsive listeners. You only go into it, you only talk to it when you feel somebody really wants to know, somebody cares. That will prompt you to open up, although still to a limited extent. You won't open up the floodgates and dare let it take you over completely. You only do it to a limited extent. Typically, survivors learn how far to open up over years of retelling, and they often reflect upon that history. Describing being taken from the Warsaw Ghetto to a building in which people were continuously brutalized, Pinka Scooter recalls. And I was there with my mother, my sister, my father for 3 nights. And I will just tell you 2 things that happened. I will not tell you all the things that happened those 3 nights because, long pause. A few minutes later, having described witnessing the aftermath of several rapes, Putin continues. And the emotions inside me were just horrendous because I wasn't just seeing it, I was feeling it. And the previous tape that I made, I think I conveyed some of the emotional feelings also. And for several months after that, I had nightmares again. And I think that my subconscious does not allow me to actually continue and feel those feelings. Many survivors refer not only to how much they retell, but also to the difference between retelling with or without feeling it. However horrific a memory, it is obviously emotion and how much can be tolerated that determines whether it is bearable and whether survivors will choose to bear retelling it. Once again, these are, a significant part, choices. Guter constructs his account between deliberate self-editing and monitoring by what he calls his subconscious, and he's typical in that respect. Agi often told me that she had anxiety and headaches before and after our interviews, but neither deterred her from wanting to continue. What is bearable is relative to what any survivor chooses to bear, and that in turn varies for different people, different circumstances, and different relationships, and different moments within a relationship. I emphasize the point because so much of conventional discussion of these issues reduces to some version of trauma, making retelling either impossible or allowing it only in emotionless and personalized ways. The actuality is enormously more complex. I've already noted the range of contingencies that impact survivors' silence that had nothing to do with trauma or other unbearable emotion. But even within survivors' anguish, there is a great range of different agonies that may or may not be bearable to recall and thus retell for different survivors at different times. Besides trauma, understood here as paralyzing terror in the face of imminent annihilation, identical to what we call shock in other contexts. There is, for example, shame associated with sustained humiliation and brutalization, memories of profound betrayal or abandonment, the anguish of being helpless to help others, too often reduced to some version of survivor guilt, and above all, bottomless loss and grief, which is what being a survivor most essentially entails. Still being here while so many others in a world once shared are gone. While all of these different agonies may on some level be associated with each other, the various ways they are associated cannot be coherently discussed unless they are differentiated first. Within contemporary trauma theory, it is also often asserted that survivors cannot access and thus retell traumatic experiences because the shock created an inherent relatedness. In Kathy Carrott's seminal formulation, trauma is, quote, not simply the literal threatening of bodily life, the fact that the threat is recognized by the mind one moment too late. Not the direct experience of the threat, but precisely the missing of this experience. From a somewhat different perspective, Dory Laub suggests that survivors' horrific experiences are, quote, events without a witness that require an engaged and sympathetic listener to help survivors retrieve and ultimately know what they endured. Here again, issues are complex. I have cited Levy's assertion that, quote, single, clamorous, terrifying episodes are not what is hardest to retell. And indeed, Levy recalls spending the first months after liberation retelling constantly, compulsively, unable to speak about anything else. Recalling his waking from torture, Jean-Henri wrote, "The bundle of limbs that is slowly recovering human semblance feels the urge to articulate the experience intellectually, right away, on the spot, without losing the least bit of time." In a diary that she began 48 hours after being liberated from a death march, and which she retrieved during our third interview, Agi wrote in April 1945, "Up until the last moment, the crematorium is our nightmare. We're telling everybody about it, whether we want to or not. Our stories are only about the crematorium, whether we want to or not." It would certainly be possible to understand the urgency, sometimes compulsion to retell as a drive to catch up with Carrott's missing moment. Clearly, however, Holocaust memory itself is not missing for these survivors. What survivors themselves describe more often concerns modulating emotional response, both during and after, than not registering and later remembering what they witnessed and endured. The urgency, sometimes compulsion to retell, could equally be understood as survivors' search for listeners. Anne-Marie asserted that the experience of persecution was at the very bottom, that of an extreme loneliness, emphasized. During the destruction, Levy famously dreamed of listeners who were always out of reach, resulting in a desolation so agonized, pain in its pure state, Levy wrote, that it was better to awaken in Auschwitz night than to endure that pain in a dream. Years after liberation, Aggie said she maintained silence because that isolation and the hope it guarded was preferable to having to face the, quote, refusal. Aggie explained. Not without encouragement, I would not have gone out and talked about the Holocaust. I didn't go out and volunteer. Oh, keep people. Now I'm going to tell you stories. You see what it is? I don't want to accept defeat. This way, in my mind, I can say, well, if they'd known, but what did they refuse? I don't want to get to the point of the refusal. I'd rather face it alone than the defeat. For Aggie, as for many other survivors, missing listeners may be closer to the heart of the matter than missing memories. If so, we are left with witnessing that is more paradoxical than absent or belated, along with crafting accounts against the anticipated incommunicable and potentially unbearable. Survivors must also posit a listener in whom they do not entirely believe. I'll return to this point at the end of the next section. The irretrievable. By the irretrievable, I refer to the dead, the communities of talk, including talk during the Holocaust, now vanished, and the present and absent sense of home that is always part of survivors' accounts. Most of us envision the dead through general images of victims rather than particular people. If we know more, and Frank again comes to mind, it is usually incidental, minimal context, and of course no personal memory. For survivors, the dead are loved ones, neighbors, cherished characters and communities, and virtually all survivors understand that part of their task is to try to speak for and about the lost. Reuben, one of the first survivors I interviewed in the 1970s, told me he used to sit in his store, a small electric parts business, and, quote, dream back to the world it was. He even imagined writing a novel, which he explained would, quote, not be about the Holocaust, but about the whole life before the Holocaust, with the Holocaust included, and then describe the complexity of that whole life, every detail the locus of care and grief. How it was, the whole variety of the Jewish people. You know, we had the Orthodox, we had the Hasidic Jews, we also had the Mitagadim who didn't believe in the Hasidic rabbis. And then you had other Jews, not Orthodox. You had the Zionists, and you had the Bund, they were socialists, you know, and then you had the communists, all Jews, 100%. They spoke Yiddish, they defend Jewish culture, the whole thing. I'm just saying you had a complete life, the whole thing. So many different characters, the good and the bad, the whole range. You don't see it anymore. It's all disappeared. I asked. And your novel would have been to show the variety, all the different people, the way they worked, the way they lived, the way they dealt with people, how it was, how happy they were, how sad they were, at different times. It's never going to be again the way they lived for generations. Reuben concluded, it's hard for anybody actually to imagine what it was like. He was not talking about the Holocaust. Aggie was reflecting. The life I was made to live is gone. I'm alive in another life. Aggie engaged fully in the life she found and made after the destruction. But a foundational homelessness also lived on, as she reflected. It is not that our joys are not real, they are entirely real. It is just that they never exist simply by themselves. They are always in reference to something else, something that can consume them in an instant. And then there are simply the blank spaces where things were that are not anymore. It is not news that masses of people can be erased from the planet as though they never were. But there is a difference between knowing that intellectually, most of us do, and knowing it in one's bones, as survivors do. Between that knowledge and survivors' ongoing lives, there is a gap in which another kind of silence resides. Sometimes it is expressed in a shrug, a sigh, a distracted glance, an expression of uncertainty that follows even the most insistent assertion. Whatever is said, there is also something else, and the potential that ongoing life and talk are only a reprieve, even a kind of pretending. Our conversations with survivors, from incidental sharing to formal testimony, are thus premised on a faith in permanence, meaning, and human solidarity, in which no survivor of genocide entirely believes. That is what makes such communication both precious and precarious. The usually unquestioned faith upon which everyday talk depends remains, for most survivors, irretrievable. Finally, talking with people. The different kinds of silence I discussed are neither mutually exclusive nor all-inclusive. Rather, as I've emphasized, they are intended to sensitize us to distinctions that are easily overlooked. In survivors' actual recounting, some or all of them operate at once. And so as we engage survivors in conversation, these categories ought themselves be put in conversation, allowing us to draw on each and all as richly and usefully as we are able. While this article focuses on Holocaust survivors, it is no less about us. In the 1970s, when I began interviewing survivors, the would-be members of my graduate committee were cordial, but they were not supportive. The first three professors with whom I spoke said the same essential two things. Hank, all the work on survivors has already been done. And anyway, the survivors are all dying. This was 1975. The truth is that it has never been easy or usual to engage survivors in their accounts at significant depth. Even today, when there are 5 times as many known survivor accounts as in the 70s, and a great deal more interpretive work, we are still, in my view, barely scratching the surface. As we move toward the time when we will actually have to rely on archived recordings rather than direct conversation, there will be that much more need for the virtues of interpretive modesty and tolerance for complexity. I hope we will find them. Thank you.